This is week number 4 for AI, robots, and ethics. And this week we are continuing our exploration into machine moral agency. As I pointed out to you before, we have 3 weeks in which we're going to be looking at machine moral agency. This is the second week that we are on this topic. This week we have 2 readings from Kenneth Hima and John Sullins. Hima's article is called Artificial Agency, and John Sullins' article is called When is a Robot a Moral Agent? And both Hima and Sullins are going to try to develop criteria for deciding whether or not a machine could be considered a moral agent. So, in effect, what they're going to do is look at the way in which we, in moral philosophy, have decided the question of moral agency for us. How are we moral agents? What criteria make us a moral agent and allow for us to extend agency to other human beings that we encounter in various social circumstances? But they will have very different ways of marking the criteria and very different ways of assembling the criteria for moral agency. And what I want us to do this week is begin to think, first of all, how it is that we have thought about moral agency in terms of basic ontological criteria as the foundation for which we develop a theory of moral agency for individuals. So look at the way that Hima develops his criteria and ask yourself about what it is that he draws on in the history of philosophy to develop this criteria, and then look at what Sullins does with regards to developing his criteria for moral agency. After you understand what each of these two authors are doing with regards to defining and characterizing moral agency, then I want us to think whether we are persuaded by the case they make. In other words, do we find Hima's case for moral agency, his criteria, to be persuasive and argumentative in a way that we can really, hook into and understand? Or do we find Sullins to provide a better account of moral criteria? And in this whole process, not only do I want us to do sort of a cost-benefit analysis of each individual author's understanding of moral agency on the basis of criteria, but I want us to ask even a more broader question, and that is ontological criteria adequate and sufficient for deciding questions of moral standing? In other words, is this the way that we perform ethics? Do we first of all look out into the world and figure out who fits the model of the criteria we have in our mind for moral inclusion, and then we extend moral consideration to them or not? In other words, I want us to be critical not only of what each individual author does with regards to their criteria for moral agency, I want us to be critical about the whole project of basing moral understanding on criteria, because this is a very standard philosophical move. It means that ethics is subordinated to ontology. In other words, we have to first of all figure out the being of an entity before we figure out their moral inclusion or exclusion. And theorists like Emmanuel Levinas have recently argued that the relationship is the other way around, that the moral categories come first and that the ontological categories follow the social relationship as a secondary event as opposed to a primary event. So I want you to read both Hima and Sullins, figure out what their criteria is, and then also be questioning the criteria they develop and the whole idea of criteria for deciding the question of moral inclusion or exclusion. As you saw also on the Facebook page, I've been posting a lot of recent things going on in the area of AI, robots, and ethics. It's out of control. There's something every day having to do with either technological unemployment, having to do with self-driving automobiles and whether they should kill the occupants of the car or not in the case of a competing set of moral concerns, autonomous weapons, sex with robots. I mean, you name it, it's all over the place. So I'll continue posting things on the Facebook page. As I said before, the items posted on the Facebook page are not necessarily required reading, but they do, I think, tie into some recent developments and some recent debates that you can really look at and begin to apply the philosophical knowledge we're developing in class to some real-world problems and some opportunities that we are currently faced with right now with the state of the art in technology as it is currently designed and utilized. So, like usual, I have posted study questions for you. I ask you to read the study questions before you start the readings, and then after you do the readings, go back to the study questions and try to respond to them as best you can in your reading journal or in your notebook, so that you can sort of assemble your thoughts with regard to this whole matter of machine moral agency. So that's all I have. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you all next week.